pivoting from case studies, stock talk, to I at least want to give you guys a highlight of some of the life lesson stuff as well. So you recall yesterday we sort of talked about the wonderful process of cultivating mentors and developing deep relationships and all. Well, the converse of that is calamities, avoiding calamities. And this kind of thinking really hit me when I was at the Wesco annual meeting roughly 15 years ago. And I remember Munger saying, one of his favorite sayings is, all I want to know is where I'm going to die, so I never go there. And everybody sort of laughed, and he said, no, I'm serious. Once you reach a certain position in life, you should spend most of your time trying to avoid the things that can derail your life and send you back to go, or worse. And he always talks about this in investing as well, but in this case, he was more talking about life decisions. And he says, what happens to too many people is that even when they've got it made, they can't help but lean out to grab the brass ring, and they fall, bringing themselves to ruin. So ever since, I've been doing a lot of thinking about calamities and the things I want to avoid. So this is so true in investing. It is so true in life, which is everybody spends 99% of their time thinking about, the next step up, the next great stock they're going to buy, the next move up in their career or their business or whatever. And they spend almost no time thinking about the calamities to avoid and taking steps to minimize the chances of some big calamity. And this applies to stocks and investing as well as life. So let me talk about the life parts of this, and I'm going to run through, this is an 80-slide presentation. I'm going to run through it just super quickly, give you the highlights. There's a lot in here. There's going to be a big section on this in my book, which I'll send you, but let me at least highlight the big ones. So when I think about, and this is, Charlie Munger talks about, he, in Poor Charlie's Almanac, he has, at least one, but he returns to this theme often, but at least in one of his major speeches, where he talks about the ways he has seen people come to ruin. So here are the 5 big ones that I've identified. Obviously, getting yourself killed or suffering a permanent injury, either of yourself or a loved one. Being in a bad marriage or suffering a permanently impaired relationship with a loved one. Losing your reputation or freedom, losing all your money, and suffering addiction or abuse. Again, I'm going to run you through this super quickly, and we'll come back. But Buffett talks about this a lot. Imagine if he said, I'm going to give you a new car, and you can pick any car you want. But here's the catch. It's the only car you get for your entire life. How would you treat that car? And of course, you'd keep it in a garage, you'd wash it regularly, you would change the oil every 1,000 miles, you'd drive it so carefully, right, to make sure it lasted for your whole life. Well, he's like, your body is just like that car. You only get one your whole life, so take care of it. And what does that mean? It basically means 2 things. 1, eating healthily. Be careful about what you put into your body. And then staying fit, exercising your body, right? Those are the 2 big things. And then obviously avoiding many calamities that can end you up in the hospital and so forth, right? So we live in a much safer world. Stuff about avoiding, in terms of treating your body and keeping it healthy, avoiding tobacco products and so forth, getting your routine mammograms, etc. Avoiding tail risks, drinking and driving, don't ride a motorcycle, wearing a helmet. I do a bunch of things that could potentially put me in jeopardy. You all probably got my email about the race I'm doing this weekend. Here's some pictures from previous races there. People sometimes get hurt doing these races. They're not particularly dangerous, although I did see a guy die. He was a big, heavy guy, and he had a heart attack out there. And I didn't see it actually happen, but I saw him on the emergency vehicle being rushed to the ambulance. I later found out the next day he didn't make it. So you probably don't want to go out and do endurance races and obstacle course races if you're not in good shape and have a weak heart. But I do a bunch of rock climbing, mountaineering, backcountry skiing. And I ride my bike in Manhattan, which is probably the single riskiest thing I do. Pretty much every day of the year, I'm riding my bike at least a couple miles from where I live on the Upper East Side down to meetings in Midtown. Going to be doing that today. So there are steps you can take, though. If you are going to do bold, adventurous things, there are steps you can take to mitigate your risks. So I don't know if you can see in this picture here of me on the top of a mountain. You know, there's sort of a 1,000-foot drop on either side, but you notice there's a rope here, this red rope here. My guide is taking the picture, and I would never go into the mountains without being roped to a guide at all times, right? So a simple, obvious way to mitigate risk. My bike looks like a Christmas tree because I have so many bright lights on it. When I ski backcountry, see that arrow there? See that backpack I'm wearing? That's like an airbag for avalanches, where if you get caught up in one, you just pull a handle and it blows up this huge airbag and allows you, most likely will save your life because it keeps you atop the avalanche as opposed to getting tumbled and buried, right? So, so suicide is one of the biggest risks out there, and the single riskiest thing you can do as it relates to suicide is having a gun in your home. So I've got a bunch of data here on suicide. Twice as many people, and this is more for those of you outside the United States, having a gun in the home is much less frequently and is obviously much less of a risk. In the United States, something like a third or 40% of all households have a gun in them. And I think most people think that that makes them safer. And in fact, it makes the likelihood of a suicide much riskier, obviously a suicide of yourself or a loved one. Twice as many people in the United States every year are killed by guns via suicide than homicide. So in terms of cars, obviously wearing a seatbelt is key. 15% of Americans who don't wear seatbelts account for 50% of the automobile fatalities. And I upgraded to a new car 2 years ago because I wanted the latest safety features, and it ended up saving our bacon about a year ago. My wife was driving home after dropping our daughter off at an early morning flight up in Massachusetts, and she fell asleep at the wheel. And she went off the road, crashed the car, fortunately walked away from it, but it was a very scary moment. It really underscored for me how if you can afford it, and that's obviously a key, but we can afford it, and I think most of the people listening to this can probably afford a new car, and I can just tell you the safety features built into new cars today, especially at the higher end, not super luxury, but even mid-range cars like the Subaru Outback, which we bought for our daughter in college, have incredible safety features that didn't even exist in cars 5 years ago. So, and by the way, a big lesson, obviously, from my wife is if you're ever feeling fatigued when you're driving, do something. Don't risk falling asleep at the wheel. She knew she was fatigued, but she was only 5 minutes from home, and she kept driving. So, by the way, when you're renting a car, rent a higher end car. Don't rent the little cheap tin cans that I always used to rent. And don't give your college age student the old family car that doesn't have the latest safety features. If you can afford it, buy them a new car. So those are a bunch of lots more details there in the slides, but I just wanted to sort of highlight, thinking about calamities and ways to mitigate the risk of one of these calamities happening to you. Calamity number 2 is one I'm seeing a lot these days as I enter my early 50s. In the past, I'd say 5 to 10 years, well over a dozen of my close friends and family have gone through divorces, and it's in almost all cases a total calamity for everyone involved. My advice to those of you who are single is choose carefully. It's the most important decision you're going to make in your life, and having the right screens, being very patient and disciplined, and making sure you're right about who you marry is super important. And be on the lookout for warning flags, and don't hesitate to walk away, even if you're already engaged and you've already scheduled the wedding. I can tell you so many stories, but my sister is twice divorced now. And in both cases, she knew that she'd made a mistake, but went through with the wedding anyway, just because it was all scheduled and would have been she had commitment bias, right? Don't let that happen to you. So here's a list of a dozen questions that I've come up with that I mainly came up with a friend of mine. And then for my daughters, my oldest daughter's she's 22, has had a serious boyfriend for 3 years. And so these are the questions that I think anyone should ask before they get married to someone. And in rough order of priority, starting with, and the gender pronouns can alternate, he or she. Is she a kind and good-hearted person, both toward you and others? Does she have a mean bone in her body? How does she treat people beneath her, like employees or waiters? Do children and dogs like her? Being married to a mean person is the worst thing in the world, and I've had it happen to friends of mine, right? If you weren't romantically interested in each other, would you be close friends? Do you make each other better? Does he have high integrity, stable, solid, predictable person? Do you trust him completely? Do you share core values, et cetera, et cetera? I'm not going to read through the whole list. I'm going to send you the slide presentation. This is the best list I can come up with, and I think a lot of people would save themselves a lot of horrible, horrible mistakes if they had asked these questions and answered them honestly before getting married to someone. Because once you're married, especially once you have kids, it becomes very difficult to extract yourself. So now turning to the married people, going through some questions, once you're married to someone, and by the way, I would say at least 2/3, if not 3/4 of the divorces I've seen, they were both good people. They were good marriages. They were happy marriages for the first 5 years, maybe an 8 on a scale of 1 to 10. But then the next 5 years, the kids came, and that puts pressure on a marriage. And the marriages, went from an 8 to a 6 to a 4 to a 2 to boom, 20 years in. So the key is every marriage fluctuates. No marriage is perfect. Every marriage fluctuates between a 6 and a 9.5 on a scale of 10. So the question is, though, is when you get down to a 6, is there a way to recognize that, identify the problems, and try and turn things around? That's the real difference between marriages that last and marriages that don't. That when they go from an 8 to a 6, is the next step back to an 8, or is the next step down to a 4? So the vast majority of divorces I've seen have been cases where the marriages ended slowly, not quickly. There's the stereotype out there that somebody cheats on their spouse and boom, you're divorced. There's something dramatic that ends a marriage. In almost all cases I've seen, the marriages ended slowly, painfully, gradually, not quickly. Philip, let me address your question here. I have a daughter. I know you have 3. I'm curious if you attempted to teach them investing, given the many successful investors started early. Can you share some parenting tips that you're such an achiever? I have made some attempts to teach my daughters investing and gotten absolutely nowhere, pretty much nowhere. And they just haven't had much of an interest in it. I set them all up with $5,000 accounts over at Ameritrade, and I put Berkshire in those accounts, but I said, I'd love you to find 5 stocks. Go find something you're interested in. Who knows? Under Armour, Snapchat, Twitter, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, the products that you use, whatever.
Tilray.
Yeah, exactly. And they, to this day, that was a few years ago, to this day, not one of them has bought a single stock. So I've tried. My oldest daughter is now out of college, has started working at Ernst & Young in the consulting area. She might be applying to Harvard Business School in a couple years. So she has started to take some interest. My middle daughter is taking a business-related class down at Wake Forest. She's a sophomore there. And she has a model stock portfolio that they're requiring her to invest. So the first stock she bought in her model portfolio a month ago, right at the peak, was Tilray. And she made 120 bucks on it in a day. It was that crazy day when it went from 150 to 300 intraday. So she called me up and I laughed and told her she'd gotten caught up in a huge bubble. She should sell it immediately in her model portfolio, which she did, and locked in the $120 gain. I'm not sure. So she's starting to show a little bit of interest, but it hasn't been because of me. But when it does happen, they tend to call me up. General parenting tips, I could go on for hours about that. I sort of laugh, and look, my kids have gotten, they won the lottery, right? They, having my wife and me as their parents, educated, good people, great marriage, living in luxury and prosperity, taking them around the world, sending them to the greatest schools imaginable that are wildly expensive, private schools on the Upper East Side of New York. They've had everything. We've really tried to teach them gratitude so they at least appreciate everything that they've gotten. It helps that my parents and my sister live in Kenya. So we've traveled to Kenya many times. So they have been to Kibera, the biggest slum in Kenya. So they do have an appreciation, and that's helped. I think they're really great, grounded kids with good hearts, and they've really turned out beautifully so far. And that's vastly more a credit to my wife than to me. But the other thing I will say is raising girls, particularly amidst great wealth. There are real challenges there, particularly around, for example, eating disorders, which I get to in calamity number 5. It is one of the biggest risks you face as a parent of daughters in the world of top 1%ers. And so I've got a bunch of ideas related to that. I'll get to that slide a little later about how to mitigate the risk of eating disorders, because I've seen it happen. It's very widespread on the Upper East Side of New York. I've seen it happen among one of my cousins for the last almost 50 years. She's been anorexic, and it is an absolutely horrific, destructive disease. And it's one of the things I have been watching out for like a hawk. But also one other theme I would say is I sort of joke that I love having girls. I have no regrets about not having any boys. But I sort of semi-joke, have girls, raise them as boys, is my parenting philosophy. And in that sense, what I'm saying is I don't coddle my girls. When they were very young, I would take them out to the park and I'd take them up to the top of the big slides and the big scary merry-go-round and other things. Like when they were 6 months or a year or 2 years old, I took away the training wheels on their bike at age 3. And I pushed them hard. I took them up to the top of the mountain at age 3 when we were skiing. I put a strap around their waist so I would ski behind them, but we would go up to the top of the mountain and ski down some real slopes, not just the silly little bunny slope. And they were always safe. I was always there to catch them. But I absolutely pushed them outside of their comfort zone. I made them cry. I told them to suck it up and get back on their feet. And if they skinned their knee or whatever, I said, suck it up, we'll put a Band-Aid on it, get back out there. Because I think a lot of kids on the Upper East Side, particularly girls growing up amidst wealth, they just grow up in a very sheltered, coddled environment, and they don't develop the resilience I think you need to be a healthy, functioning human being. And so I've been very deliberate in trying to inculcate that. So let's see. Daniel recommends a book on back to marriage, Gottman's book, The 7 Principles for Making Marriage Work. I just finished reading that book myself a few weeks ago. I agree, highly recommend it. Haroon says, with 3 daughters just starting their adult life, why wouldn't you give them the advice that Buffett gives to them? Just buy the S&P 500 index through a low-cost provider and hold it for the next 40 years. I think that's excellent advice. If they actually wanted to come and sit down with me, I might tell them, and that's in fact what I've done with my parents. Most of my parents' money is indexed, but then I believe that I have the ability to guide them into 5 good stocks, and so I've done a part of that. Part of what I'm doing with my daughters with these little $5,000 accounts, this is just to generate a little bit of interest and teach them something about the investing world. It's more of a learning exercise, not the just what they should do with their retirement funds exercise. So good questions and comments, keep them coming, and let me just get back to whipping through this presentation. How to maintain a healthy marriage. Be sensitive to the big things, just your day-to-day behavior toward each other. But also on the kids, on financial matters, and on just communicating on the key things, including your sex life, by the way, is critical. But also be sensitive to the little things, leaving the toilet seat up, hogging the blankets, leaving dirty dishes around. Little things can be like burrs under the saddle, and can really develop and chafe, and little things add up. And it's like what Buffett talks about. The chains of habit are too light to be felt until they are too heavy to be broken. If you let yourself slip into bad habits around your spouse, she, I think most of the people on this call are men, right? So she is not going to leave you immediately. In fact, the person you can treat the crappiest with the fewest consequences is probably your spouse, right? But eventually there will be consequences. So don't let yourself get into bad habits. It's so easy to get sloppy, and that sloppiness can really build up, and 10, 15, 20 years later, those little things will all come back and bite you in the ass with a major calamity. So look for mutual interests. I've seen some marriages end just because two people just went in sort of different directions. As one of my friends put it, we became like two ships passing in the night. And why are we still married? So looking for regular times to get together. When I'm not teaching these seminars every morning, my wife and I walk our dog out in the park every morning. It's a nice little 20 minutes that we spend together, right? Looking for little things like that. Obviously, be sensitive to major breaches. Don't even get on that slippery slope of infidelity by flirting. And by the way, be careful. A lot of people think, oh, I've made a lot of money. Everything's going to be good. Here are the 7 different ways I can come up with why I've seen divorce result from people making too much money. Becoming wealthy ended up leading to divorce. So, and by the way, you may think, okay, what does this all have to do with investing? Why are you talking about this in an investing seminar? I have seen so many people where their divorce correlated with their worst period of performance in their funds and their careers. And I don't think it's correlated. I think there's causation here. It sucks up a huge amount of time. It sucks up even more mental energy and creates mental stress. No matter how rich you are, it puts you under huge financial pressure that can lead to reckless swing for the fences investment behavior. And once you're separated, now you're back out there on the dating scene, and that sucks up a huge amount of your mental energy, time, and let's be honest, can lead to extreme sleep deprivation for extended periods, right? So would you want to be investing in someone's going through all 4 of these things simultaneously for an extended period, often for a year or 2 or more? So I know there are LPs out there who have a policy of redeeming if a fund manager is going through a divorce, and I used to think that was crazy, and I no longer think it's crazy. I don't think you should have an ironclad rule, but I don't think it's crazy. Another risk factor is if once your youngest child reaches adolescence, that seems to be around the time when I've seen a lot of divorces happen. And I think part of it is that the parents, the marriage, it isn't like all of a sudden the marriage goes bad. It's probably been going bad for a while, but the parents stay together when the kids are little. Once the kids reach adolescence, it's time to end it, right? So be very careful about getting blindsided right around this time. So A lot of this advice, by the way, doesn't just relate to your spouse, but just in general, in your life, in your business life, in your personal life. In the same way, you want to be very careful who you get married to. You want to be very careful picking your friends and who you do business with. You will rightly be judged on who you associate with. And look, I can't tell you how many people over the years, I've met, become friendly with, and then something happens, and I just say, you know what, I just don't want to be associated with this person. 99.9% of the time, I just sort of quietly disengage, right? There's just no upside to telling somebody, as Buffett and Munger always joke, you can always tell someone to go to hell tomorrow, right? Just don't say anything, just disengage. Now, the problem is you can't do that with your cousins, your in-laws, etc. You're going to continue to see them, at Thanksgiving and things like that. But in that case, you got to make an effort. Yes, you can sort of quietly disengage, but if you're going to see them and be around with them, you got to make an effort. And I've seen so many people just be very foolish in terms of how they behave. Someone doesn't like their mother-in-law or doesn't like their brother-in-law or something. And it's very clear. They make their feelings clear, and that just leads to all sorts of nastiness and ruptured relationships, and it's just really dumb. Think about all the people in your family, including in-laws and so forth, and think about, am I really those who you do not have a good relationship with? Are you really making an effort and being smart in that area? So the same dozen questions you ask in picking a spouse, 7 of them are the same questions I would ask in picking friends. 6 of them are the same questions I would ask in choosing your business partners or colleagues. So calamity number 3, loss of reputation or freedom. Your reputation and integrity are your most valuable assets, and they can be lost in a heartbeat. So other than your brain, your reputation is your most important asset. It takes a lifetime to build and can be destroyed in minutes. And if you really are foolish, you might not only lose your reputation, you'll lose your freedom. You break a law, you do some insider trading or something like that, and you end up in prison. So how do you, obviously just being very sensitive to this, don't go anywhere close to gray areas, but also be, usually when people make these kinds of mistakes, it's because they're under pressure. And you can take steps to make sure that you're not under duress. So for example, don't use leverage. That means you're much less likely to get under pressure financially, where you might be tempted to cross the line into something like insider trading, for example. So keep in mind, the test here isn't whether something is legal, it's whether it passes the front page of the local paper test. So you keep in mind also that you are not judged, and you will not be remembered by how you behave 99% of the time. It's by your worst 1% moments. So be very, very careful it's the tails. How many cases can you think of where someone has really brought themselves to ruin by one dumb tweet or something that they said on television or put out in an email, or behaved inappropriately towards someone, and that's all people will remember. So calamity number 4, losing all your money. The surest way to get poor quickly is to get rich quickly. The second way to impact your financial status is to get fired or get divorced. So obviously avoiding those things, avoiding debt. Now, obviously some kinds of debt, like subsidized student loans or fixed rate, low interest, tax deductible mortgages, can be smart debt. But credit cards and installment loans and payday loans and so forth, absolute calamity. Just investing in liquid stocks of sound companies without leverage or options, you're probably going to be fine. But avoiding stuff like Bitcoin or speculating and stuff, and especially investing in privates. I've seen people lose a lot of money. There's an infinite amount of money you can invest in private companies. And they all sound so great, and you're going to make 10 times your money, etc. And you can permanently lose huge amounts of money doing that. So lastly, addiction and abuse. The biggies here would be alcohol and drug addiction. There's an opiate epidemic sweeping the United States. It's killing 88,000 people a year are dying from alcohol. 70,000 people are dying from drug overdoses. 2/3 of that is opiates. One way to avoid it is just absolutely avoid alcohol and drugs. I almost never drink to excess. Maybe I've been drunk a dozen times in my life. Never once tried any drug. And the reason is because there are only two possible outcomes. I'll either like it or I won't. Well, if I like it, that now I'm on the slippery slope, right? And that I really don't want that. Or I don't like it. It's just a shitty experience. Why would I want that? Right? So gambling and trading is a serious addiction, and it can manifest itself in your portfolio as an investor. Trading stocks is highly addictive. And so I never made a trade in 18 years of managing money. So you might say, well, wait a sec, how did you manifest your positions? And the answer is I'd email my broker or call my broker and just tell them, buy me 10,000 shares of Disney. But I never actually used the app to actually go in and trade the stocks myself to try and buy and sell them. So that's one way to try and insulate yourself from the risk of getting hooked on trading. Another addiction, by the way, as we've seen over and over and over again, is a sex addiction. And some men, it's almost always men, really just get a rush from this kind of behavior, and I'm glad that it's leading a lot of these men to ruin, because it's awful behavior and does a lot of damage, and they've been able to get away with it for eons basically, and finally I think that is changing, but stay far away from this. So eating disorders, what we talked about earlier, and it's particularly a risk for teenage girls in top 1% households. So one of the things my wife and I did is we never had any dieting in our house, just plenty of healthy food, never made any comments about what our daughters ate. We consciously steered them away from things where eating disorders are prevalent, like modeling, ballet, figure skating, or gymnastics. And it turns out daughters in particular look for signals about beauty and body image and so forth from their fathers. So I was always super careful about what I said. Never in a million years would I ever say anything like, don't eat that, it'll make you fat. Or, looking at some woman and saying, wow, she's hot, or something like that. Never comments or jokes about eating or weight. Absolutely taboo subjects. Another thing for those of you with younger kids is keeping them safe from sexual abuse. 25% of children are sexually abused before their 18th birthday. Almost none of them report it. Almost none of the sex offenders are ever caught. So just keep an eye, don't be paranoid, but just keep an eye on your kids and be careful of situations in which there are long periods of unsupervised time with certain adults where so-called grooming can occur. So the most likely abusers are extended family members, teachers, coaches, and as we've seen in the press almost every day, religious figures. So don't overreact, but don't underreact to warning signs like alcohol or drug abuse or odd behavior. It is not normal for a 32-year-old to be best friends with a 12-year-old. And if you ever do come across behavior that crosses the line, you absolutely have to expose it and report it and make a big stink about it, because I promise you that this is not the first time. There is no such thing as someone who molests only one child. So that now you're like, okay, now my kids are through their teenage years, they're off to college, now it's all good, right? But of course, depending on the study and how it's defined, as many as a quarter of all women, 5 to 8% of men report being sexually assaulted during their time in college. And by the way, people who don't go to college during that same time period in their lives, late teens, early 20s, it's even more dangerous not to go to college. So it's not like college is the cause. It's just that time in life when there are a lot of drunken parties and guys are looking to get laid. And so, I've got daughters, so I'm particularly concerned and have actively warned them about being very careful, particularly my daughter at Wake Forest, which plays big time college sports. She's a member of a sorority. They have fraternities. and having her be just very careful. And the most important advice I give my daughters is it's okay to have a drink or two drinks or maybe even three drinks over the course of a few hours, but never, ever, ever get blackout drunk. You are just inviting all sorts of calamities. And that would be true of men as well, but men are less likely to be sexually assaulted when they're blackout drunk and more likely to fall out of a window or get hit by a car or something like that. Again, there are just risk factors out there, and being aware of them and teaching your kids about them is key. So last couple slides here. The major calamity, if you're religious, is that after you die, you end up going to hell. So, think about, whether you're religious or not, is thinking about living your life in such a way that if you do get to the pearly gates, you can make a pretty good case for getting in. So this is what I talked about the other day, where I sort of try to live my life in a way that I'm beloved while I'm alive. There are a lot of people who come to my service because I've made a positive impact on their life. And if there are any pearly gates, I'll get through them. Lastly, a couple thoughts on how to handle calamities, because there's no such thing. I mean, everyone by definition, when they go through life, is going to have to handle the death of a loved one. Almost all people outlive their parents, so you're going to have to deal with the death of your parents at some point in your life, right? As just one example, but there isn't a single person in the world who doesn't, either to them or someone close to them, who has a serious illness, cancer, that kind of thing. So calamities happen. So how do you deal with it? Now, some calamities are fixable. If my grandfather didn't talk to his brother for the last 40 years of their lives because they had an argument, and both of them were just stubborn, angry men, and that was just insane, right? It's a calamity if you have a permanently ruptured relationship with your brother or a loved one. And usually those relationships can be fixed, and so fix it. The other thing you could do is knowing that calamities do happen, trying to build a strong network of friends and family so that there are people there to catch you, a support network in place to support you when you're going through a tough period is a smart thing to do. When you're going through the calamity, try to wall it off. Don't wall it off entirely, but try and wall it off mentally. Seek professional help. We can all afford to go see a shrink. If your priest or religious figure, there are professionals. The calamity that is happening to you has surely happened to lots of other people, and so there are trained professionals that can help you. Feeling and expressing gratitude is key. Even when terrible things are happening, there's usually a lot to be grateful for overall in your life. And focusing on the long run. A lot of calamities pass or they get better over time. And one way to get through them is just to have what Navy SEALs call the 3-foot view, which is when they're climbing a big rock face and there's 1,000 feet above them and there's 1,000 feet below them, and they're sort of scared, they're miserable. This is what I'm going to be in a similar place at about midnight on Saturday. The temperature is going to be 34 degrees. I'm going to be wet. I'm going to be cold doing this world's toughest mudder race. And instead of thinking, God, I've got another 12 hours to go this race, I don't see how I'm possibly going to make it, I should just quit or whatever, you instead just think about putting one foot in front of the other, putting one hand in front of the other, and just think about, okay, if I'm going through a calamity like a divorce is a process. And it may take a year, it may take 2 years, but eventually you're going to get through it. And the best thing you can do is think about, okay, what do I got to do today? Just break it down into little bite-sized things. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, right? And so that's another way to think about handling calamities. So any questions or thoughts on, let me see here, let me pull up any questions here. So Daniel says, marriage versus career, wealth, fame grows in importance over time, should be viewed as your most important investment. I agree, absolutely. Now look, and I've had some situations where, people 10, 15 years, 20 years into a marriage, either their spouse changes or whatever, and it turns out actually it's best for both parties to end that marriage. They will both be happier for the remaining 50 plus years of their lives. In which case, do what you got to do, right? But I would say in most cases, it's the opposite, which is you want to make that last. Ending a marriage, particularly with their kids and assets involved, is just so difficult. And investing in it and thinking, it's just so easy to get sloppy and stupid and ruin a good thing. Just by being sloppy and stupid, not necessarily, going and banging a prostitute when you're in Vegas or something. That's not what causes these divorces generally. So totally agreed. William says, do you have any advice on balancing spending time with your kids, working out, job, advancing your knowledge and hobbies? Yeah, just extend the day and create an extra few hours a day. I wish, right? That's the hard challenge. And this challenge gets the further you go through your life. Obviously, you're going to have more kids, not fewer. They're older, not younger. And so this is one of the things that really, in many ways, tripped me up, whereas my life became so fulfilled. And one of the things you didn't mention here, but was big in my life, was all of my philanthropic engagements and all of the mentoring that I do, because I'm sort of a high-profile public figure. And you need to just be super careful and cognizant that you don't take your eye off the ball of your business and your career, and of your marriage, by the way. I've definitely seen marriages end because people get all involved with all their other activities and they just don't spend enough time cultivating the relationship and nurturing their relationship with their spouse, right? So I guess my advice is one, just be very conscious of it. Two, understand, just be conscious of the importance of time allocation and making sure that you are allocating your time consistent with what your priorities are. So if staying in shape and being healthy is important, saying, okay, I've got 45 minutes to 1 hour a day. And if that's all the time I can spare right now, given all the other things going on in my life, then I've got to be super efficient. So I have two personal trainers that I work out with periodically. I've got a number of boutique fitness classes like Rip Fit and Tone House. A lot of people like Soul Cycle, that kind of thing, where it's organized, it's scheduled, it's intense, and I get a hell of a workout in a relatively short period of time. When my schedule is a little more relaxed, for example, in the summer, that's the time when I'll go take a couple hours to play tennis, when I play a bunch of pickup basketball, where the workout's not nearly as intense, but I just love those sports. But again, you just got to be conscious of that time allocation. Carving out time to walk my wife to work every morning with Rosie, and spending that 20 to 30 minutes, whereas I used to just sit at home and, she'd give me a quick kiss as she went out the door because I work from a home office, and I would just sit there doing more emails, right? And one of the smartest, best decisions I ever made was, 5 or 10 years ago, to carve out that time in the morning to go out and take a nice walk with my wife. That's really important to maintaining a healthy marriage. So let's see. Whitney, this presentation on calamities may be the best one of the past 6 days. You deserve applause for putting this together and speaking publicly about these issues as part of investment course. Bravo. Thank you, Haroon. It's very interesting. I get mixed feedback from this. Some people are like, what? Why is this part of an investment course? But some people, it really resonates with them and they feel like it's the most valuable thing. So I'm glad it resonated with you, Haroon. I hope those of you watching this either live or on video, take the time. I've run through this super quickly, and there's a lot more in the slides if you take the time to go through them, which I'll of course send around to you later today.